Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Amarachi stood by the window of her vast glass-walled bedroom, staring into the quiet darkness that stretched beyond their estate walls. The Abuja night breeze whispered against the curtain, but her soul felt heavier than air. She had been up for hours waiting, again, for her husband, Chike. The same man she had married 10 years ago, when he had nothing but vision in his eyes and trembling in his hands. Amarachi had sold her late father's farmland to fund Chike's first logistics contract. She had followed him from Enugu to Lagos, then to Abuja. She had laid the first brick of his now billionaire empire with her bare hands, abandoning her own dream of becoming a legal icon in favor of his ambition. Now in the cold silence of wealth, she sat alone with a teacup she had reheated 3 times. The marriage that once sparkled like their engagement diamond now felt like glass, fragile, see-through, and already cracked. Lately, Chike was no longer present. Not in conversation, not in warmth, and certainly not in loyalty. Their once shared laughter had turned into dry exchanges about meetings, invoices, and charity events neither of them attended. He returned home late, claiming boardroom emergencies or investor dinners, but his clothes never smelled like office air. They smelled of expensive perfume Amarachi didn't wear. He never met her eyes anymore, just looked past her like she was one of the sculptures that decorated the hallway. Amarachi had tried to pretend it was the stress of expansion, that maybe the weight of success was suffocating his affection. But deep down, she felt it. Something had shifted, not outside, but within him. Her heart, once a sanctuary of hope, now beat with anxiety. And worst of all, she began to feel invisible in a mansion she helped build. She spent her days overseeing charity homes, avoiding socialites who only praised her because of her surname. She missed intimacy, simple intimacy. A hug that wasn't an obligation. A laugh that wasn't rehearsed. Her heart began to ache for something real, something pure, something not touched by betrayal. Yet she said nothing. No confrontation. No accusations. She didn't want to become that wife, the one begging for her husband's love. Still, something in her spirit stirred violently the night Chike came home at 2:18 a.m., smelling of expensive scotch and a lipstick that wasn't hers. He didn't even notice the uneaten food on the dining table. He walked past her like a ghost and mumbled something about being tired. Amarachi blinked back the sting in her eyes and stared at the man she once thought would protect her. A question rose slowly in her chest like bile. If this isn't love anymore, then what am I holding on to? Ngozi had always been more than a best friend. She was a sister Amarachi never had. From childhood to adulthood, their bond was like an unbroken rope, until now. Ngozi had lived in their home during university, and Amarachi had paid her school fees when her father died. She bought her clothes for her first job interview and stood as her referee when she applied for her first banking job. When Chike became a billionaire, Amarachi didn't forget where they came from. She brought Ngozi closer, making her personal assistant in one of her foundations. Trust for Amarachi wasn't given lightly, but Ngozi had earned hers. Or so she thought. Lately, however, Ngozi's presence in the house began to feel invasive. She came unannounced, stayed too long, wore tighter dresses, called Chike too often. But Amarachi forced herself to dismiss the unease. It was Ngozi, her Ngozi, she would never. But betrayal has a smell. It lingers in places words don't go. Amarachi noticed the coded glances, the inside jokes between Chike and Ngozi when they thought she wasn't looking. She noticed how Ngozi's hand lingered on Chike's shoulder just a bit too long. Still, Amarachi swallowed her instincts, blaming paranoia, not truth. But one afternoon, she stumbled upon Ngozi's phone on the kitchen counter while Ngozi was in the guest bathroom. A message notification blinked on screen. One line. One message that shattered her world. It read, "She suspects nothing. Tonight's wine or nothing." Amarachi's breath caught. She felt cold sweat form on her back. Her heart beat like thunder. Her trembling fingers tapped to open more, only to see a thread of chats between her husband and her best friend. The messages weren't vague. They were filled with mockery, lust, and plans. Plans that mentioned her name in the past tense. Shaking, Amarachi set the phone down before Ngozi returned. She said nothing. Her hands trembled as she poured water into a glass for Ngozi. The woman she once called her sister took the glass and smiled, even complimented her geli. Amarachi forced a smile back, her lips stiff, her soul crying. Every giggle, every story Ngozi shared that evening sounded like knives slicing through her ribs. Her eyes burned, but she refused to blink. She watched as her best friend sat comfortably in her living room, plotting to remove her from the picture like expired furniture. Amarachi felt like screaming, like shattering glass, but she did neither. She sat still, nodding, and let her world quietly fall apart. It was meant to be a quiet evening. Chaik had told her he was heading to the penthouse suite at one of his hotels to meet an international investor. Amarachi, playing the docile wife, pretended to believe him. But something inside her stirred, an instinct born not of suspicion, but survival. That evening, she asked her driver to take her to the hotel quietly, with tinted windows. She didn't know what she was looking for until she saw Chaik's car parked at the far end of the lot. She told the driver to circle the back. And that's when she saw it, Ngozi, in a deep red dress, stepping out of a separate car and entering through the private entrance with a keycard Amarachi herself had once used. Her stomach twisted. Something cracked in her. Amarachi didn't follow immediately. Instead, she waited 30 minutes, then entered through a different floor using the staff lift. Years ago, she'd helped design the hotel's layout. She knew the back hallways, the thin drywall, and where the vents carried sound. She crouched by the corridor behind the executive suite and heard voices, laughing, giddy, drunk with arrogance. It was them, her husband, her best friend, and every word they spoke sliced her soul open. She's too naive, Ngozi laughed. Always busy with charity and wearing long skirts. No wonder you're bored. Chaik chuckled and added, the only thing left is to take full control. Once the final papers are signed, she's no longer needed. She's more valuable dead than alive anyway. Her lawyers won't fight too hard. They think she's soft. Amarachi sat frozen in place. Her ears rang. Her heart stopped. Dead. The word echoed. Her entire body shivered in betrayal so sharp, she felt herself losing breath. Tears didn't fall. Not yet. Not when the wound was still fresh. She waited. Listened as they toasted with wine. Heard Chaik moan about her being too holy, too emotionally exhausting. Heard Ngozi say, she won't see it coming. Amarachi stood quietly, shaking, but not broken. The woman who entered that corridor was a devoted wife. The woman who stood up and walked away was something else now, betrayed, reborn. Amarachi realized she could not confront this with emotions. Her tears meant nothing to them. They were already laughing over her grave. But what if she gave them exactly what they wanted, on her terms? Amarachi's hands shook as she set the dinner table that night. The mansion, though lit by crystal chandeliers and scented with imported roses, felt like a tomb, waiting to swallow her. Chaik had called earlier, his tone unusually soft, telling her to relax and prepare something special for us. Those words should have comforted her, but instead they rang like a threat. Amarachi knew too much now. She had read the messages, heard their laughter, their plans, their mockery. She moved through the motions with mechanical precision, her face hiding a storm in her chest. She set the wine glasses, poured water into a jug, and carefully plated the roasted chicken she had overseen the chef prepare. But deep in her soul, she braced herself. Tonight, she wasn't just a wife. She was prey walking into the lion's den with eyes wide open. When Chaik walked in, his smile was warm, almost boyish. To an outsider, it would seem like love had returned. But to Amarachi, it was a cruel performance. She noticed his eyes flick briefly toward the decanter of red wine on the table, then to her glass, then back to her face. That glance told her everything. He wanted her to drink first. Her hands trembled as she lifted the glass. Her heart pounded, so hard she feared he could hear it. With a smile that tore her soul apart, she lifted the wine to her lips. She tilted it, letting the liquid touch her tongue, but never swallowing. Instead, she let it pool in her mouth, excused herself softly, and went into the kitchen, pretending to fetch salt. There, she spat the wine into the sink, rinsed her mouth quickly, and steadied her shaking body against the marble counter. In that moment, the reality became undeniable. Her husband, the man she built an empire with, was trying to kill her. Returning to the table, she wore a mask of calm. She laughed at his shallow jokes, cut into the chicken, and pretended to sip more. She watched as Chaik relaxed, the tension in his shoulders easing, as if he believed victory was near. Amarachi's soul wept silently, but her face was unreadable. She was acting for her life. For the rest of the night, she played along, even letting him kiss her forehead before bed. But when he turned away and fell into a deep, satisfied sleep, Amarachi lay awake, her eyes burning into the ceiling. She felt numb, but beneath that numbness, something sharp was growing: resolve. They thought she was weak, naive, and blind. They thought she would crumble. But Amarachi realized in that darkness that her survival depended on silence, on patience, on cunning. She was no longer the devoted wife. She was a woman marked for death who would not only outlive her betrayers, but make them choke on their own cruelty. The morning sun streamed into the room, but Amarachi's heart was darker than midnight. She moved about quietly, pouring Chaik's tea, ironing his shirt, playing the role of the submissive wife with flawless execution. Yet, inside her, her soul had detached from the life she once lived. Every gesture, every smile, every word was an act. Her mind kept replaying the laughter she had overheard in the hotel, the message she had seen on Ngozi's phone, and the bitter taste of poisoned wine on her tongue. For years, Amarachi had prided herself on being loyal, patient, forgiving. But she realized now that those qualities had made her a target. Chaik didn't see her kindness as strength. He saw it as weakness. Ngozi didn't see her generosity as love. She saw it as stupidity. Amarachi finally understood. If she didn't act now, they would bury her for Betrayal. She spent that day in deep thought, her body moving on autopilot, but her mind calculating with a sharpness she didn't know she possessed. Confrontation was useless. If she accused them, they would deny, mock, or worse, accelerate their plan. Telling outsiders was dangerous too. Chaik's power stretched across banks, courts, and police stations. Ngozi was sly, always prepared with tears and manipulative words. Amarachi realized she couldn't fight them in their world. She needed to step out of it. The only way to beat them was to become invisible, dead, but alive. That idea settled in her chest like a dangerous comfort. She thought of her late father's words. The person who laughs last is the one who kept quiet long enough to learn the enemy's weakness. Amarachi finally saw her path, not to scream, not to fight, not to run, but to disappear, to let them believe they had succeeded, so they would expose themselves fully. That night, as Chaik snored peacefully beside her, Amarachi silently wept. Not because she was weak, but because she was mourning. She mourned the girl who believed in love. She mourned the marriage she had sacrificed her dreams for. She mourned the friendship she had given her blood for. And when the tears were done, she wiped her face and breathed differently. For the first time, she no longer felt bound to them. She began to plan. Every detail mattered. The accident, the timing, the cover, the few loyal people she could trust. She thought of her driver, a man who had served her father before serving her. She thought of her father's lawyer, who had always warned her about Chaik's arrogance. These would be her silent allies. And, as dawn approached, Amarachi made her vow. She would die, but only to be reborn. And when she rose, the people who tried to bury her would find themselves suffocating in the graves they dug. The day of the accident was deceptively ordinary. Amarachi dressed in a simple Ankara gown and flat slippers, not her usual designer outfits. She wanted no suspicion, no attention. She packed a small bag with only essentials, her old phone, some cash, her father's rosary beads. As she walked out, the house staff greeted her respectfully, unaware that this was the last time they would see her as Madame Amarachi. Chaik had left early, claiming to be meeting investors in Lagos, but Amarachi knew where he truly was. The thought of him in Ngozi's arms fueled her determination. By evening, she drove out herself, a rare move for her, toward the lonely cliffside road she knew well, where the waters below were deep and merciless. Her loyal driver, whom she had quietly confided in days before, followed in another car, ready to assist with the plan. The stage was set. Amarachi's death would be the beginning of her survival. At the cliffside, she parked her car, her hands trembling as she placed her handbag, scarf, and wedding ring neatly on the driver's seat. Those items would be found later. She stepped out, her eyes staring into the vast, dark waters below. The waves crashed violently, echoing her emotions. Her chest tightened as memories of Chaik's early love washed over her. His laughter, his promises, his trembling hands as he first proposed. She remembered Ngozi's childhood tears, the days they shared bunk beds and dreams. All those memories mocked her now. "I have to let them bury me," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. "Only then will I rise." Her driver approached quietly, his eyes filled with sorrow but also loyalty. With his help, she rolled the car towards the cliff. It plunged into the darkness below, crashing with a thunderous echo that drowned out her sob. Amarachi stood frozen, watching her life sink. When the authorities came later, they found the wreckage, her personal items, and declared her dead. Chaik performed the perfect show of grief, sobbing at the police station, holding her handbag like a widower broken by fate. Ngozi clung to his side, her crocodile tears staining his shirt. The press swarmed, the nation mourned. To them, Amarachi was gone. But in reality, she was hidden in a small safe house on the outskirts of town, protected by her father's lawyer and her loyal driver. From the shadows, she watched her own funeral streamed online. She saw Chaik weep theatrically before the cameras, then saw him later that night, smiling and drinking champagne with Ngozi in their mansion bedroom. Her chest tightened with pain, but she did not break. She whispered to herself in the silence of her hideout, "Let them rejoice. Let them inherit a ghost. Their laughter will choke them soon enough." The house Amarachi now lived in was nothing like the mansion she had once called home. It was a modest bungalow tucked deep in the outskirts of Kyuj, far from the flashing cameras and society columns of Abuja. The compound was surrounded by high fencing and hedges thick enough to hide the secrets buried within it. Her father's old lawyer, Barrister Kenneth, had arranged everything, quietly purchasing the property in his own name months earlier after Amarachi first hinted at her suspicions. Now, with the world believing she was dead, Amarachi sat inside a dim room, her phone streaming her own funeral on a cracked screen. The live stream was filled with tears, wailing women, and dramatic mourners, some real, many fake. But Amarachi's eyes remained fixed on two figures, Chaik in a black kaftan and Ngozi, heavily veiled but standing too close, her hand brushing his every few seconds. They had played their roles to perfection. She watched as Chaik shook hands with guests, some even clapping his back like a man of resilience. It was disgusting. Amarachi's hands clenched tightly around the blanket wrapped around her. Her body was alive, but her heart was dying all over again. What broke her was not just the performance, it was the fact that she recognized those tears. She had once believed in them. Chaik's voice, cracked with emotion, eulogized her like a man who had lost his oxygen. "She was my everything," he said at the podium, trembling, wiping away tears. "Without her, I wouldn't be here today." The crowd sighed, and the cameras flashed. But Amarachi, sitting in the dark, felt her stomach twist in disgust. His voice was the same voice that had once called her my queen after lovemaking. The same lips that now wept for her had once whispered promises under the moonlight. Yet, she knew now it was all a lie. She watched as he wept, then later that night, switched to a private stream sent by her loyal driver. It showed Chaik and Ngozi at a private party in the mansion, laughing with champagne in hand. No mourning clothes, no sadness, just music, clinking glasses, and a toast to a new beginning. Amarachi bit her lip until blood filled her mouth. Their celebration was her motivation. The pain didn't stop with the lies. The media adored Chaik now, a strong billionaire widower continuing his late wife's legacy. Donations flowed in. Socialites called him an example of strength. NGOs reached out to Ngozi for emotional support. The world turned in their favor, just as Amarachi had feared. But she didn't act. She didn't expose them yet. She knew better. Watching in silence allowed her to see more, to learn more, to gather more. She noticed how Ngozi now wore her signature perfumes, how she walked in her heels, how she had moved into the master bedroom and even repainted it. Amarachi took notes, screenshots, voice recordings. Everything was being documented. Because Amarachi wasn't coming back for revenge in secret. She was going to return when the world was watching. So when their empire burned, there would be no escape, no denials. Just raw disgrace. Barely a week after Amarachi's burial, the mansion that once echoed with her laughter became a playground for her enemies. Ngozi had moved in officially. She threw a healing housewarming under the guise of spiritual cleansing, but Amarachi, watching through secret CCTV access connected by a technician loyal to her, saw the truth. Ngozi paraded around in Amarachi's silk robes, the ones she used to wear on Sunday mornings. She welcomed guests with loud laughter, introduced herself as the new lady of the house, and even instructed the house staff to call her Madame Ngozi. Chaik watched her with half pleasure, half irritation, but said nothing. It was obvious she was taking up space faster than he anticipated. Amarachi watched the celebration like a ghost watching her murderers dance on her grave. The same people who had come to cry during her burial now filled the living room with music and mockery. Amarachi felt like tearing through the screen, but instead, she stared blankly, recording every face, every betrayal. In the video, she saw Ngozi take out Amarachi's wedding dress from storage and laugh while trying it on in front of guests. The pain hit Amarachi so deeply, her chest burned. Ngozi swayed in front of the mirror and giggled. "Should I wear this when Chaik and I finally make it official?" Her friends clapped and screamed. "Yes, Jor. That one go pepper people well." Chaik walked in, heard it, and smirked. "Do whatever you like," he said lazily, sipping wine. There it was. Her memories turned into props for a wicked love story. Amarachi pressed pause and sobbed in silence. That wedding dress had cost her 6 months of planning. It was the one she wore when Chaik promised forever. Now it was a costume in a comedy she never agreed to star in. The betrayal wasn't just in their affair. It was in how quickly they rewrote her existence, as if she were nothing but dust. But the pain would not break her. Instead, it strengthened her. Amarachi began to study them like a scientist studies a disease. She learned their routines, their alliances, their weaknesses. She watched Chaik flirt with Ngozi, but hesitate to publicly announce their relationship. She noticed how Ngozi spent money recklessly, ordering luxury items Amarachi had once refused to buy out of modesty. She saw how the staff began to whisper behind closed doors, how tension quietly simmered under the fake smiles. Amarachi recorded everything. She forwarded key footage to her lawyer. Her fake death had given her freedom she never had before, the power to plan without threat. As she closed her laptop that night, she whispered a promise, one that was no longer born from pain but from precision. Let them eat, let them dance. Because soon they will choke. The real war began in boardrooms Amarachi had once walked through as a respected founder. Chaik, now emboldened by the assumption that his wife was dead, began moving swiftly, replacing board members loyal to Amarachi with puppets who answered only to him. He filed legal documents to transfer her shares to himself, using forged signatures and backdated authorizations. Most of the board didn't resist. After all, who challenges a grieving husband claiming to protect his late wife's legacy? Amarachi's foundations, which once fed children in the north and built rural clinics in Enugu, were now being turned into tax havens and slush funds for luxury projects. The man she once thought of as her protector was now her greatest thief. Watching it all in real time through intercepted email chains and confidential staff leaks, Amarachi was forced to confront a deeper truth. Chaik wasn't just greedy, he was evil. But he wasn't alone. Ngozi, now acting as his unofficial executive partner, had started attending foundation meetings, arrogantly giving instructions in Amarachi's name. She went as far as changing the names of two major initiatives. The Amarachi Scholarship Fund was renamed Ngozi Future Builders. Amarachi saw the photos in the press. Ngozi smiling in front of banners bearing her name while holding hands with children Amarachi had personally sponsored. The pain returned like fire in her chest. How do you grieve a life you're still breathing in? How do you watch someone wear your name like a costume while you're trapped in silence? But Amarachi did not act out of impulse. She acted like a woman who knew her enemies were arrogant enough to believe they had won. And it was that arrogance that would bury them. Amarachi, through her lawyer, began the first phase of her silent war, triggering a private audit using anonymous reports. She didn't sign her name. She didn't make calls. But anonymous tips began to flood the regulatory boards. Staff who had once been loyal to her began to leak internal invoices. Someone even sent her an audio recording of Ngozi screaming at a board member for stalling their wedding because some paperwork was incomplete. Amarachi listened to every second like a surgeon reviewing x-rays. The pieces were coming together. The fraud, the greed, the blasphemous love affair. All of it was being documented. Because Amarachi wasn't just coming back to reclaim what was hers. She was coming back to bury what they'd built on her grave. The old wine cellar beneath the guest house had become Amarachi's war room. Its walls, once filled with vintage bottles and imported glassware, now held maps, phone logs, printed emails, and transcripts from voice recordings. Every night, Amarachi sat with Barrister Kenneth and her driver Uche, going over the growing mountain of evidence. Uche, who now acted as her eyes and ears inside the mansion compound, had planted listening devices in key places, the master bedroom, Chaik's private office, and even the central living room chandelier. Chaik and Ngozi, now drunk on the illusion of security, spoke freely. They laughed about fooling the press, mocked the old woman's weak legacy, and even made crude jokes about Amarachi's delayed death. It was surreal, like watching two hyenas celebrate after mauling a lioness, unaware she was still breathing. Amarachi no longer cried while listening. Her eyes didn't water. Her jaw only tightened. She had cried enough. Now she documented. One night, a particularly damning recording came through. Ngozi, tipsy on whiskey, confessed to one of her friends during a house party. "You think it was an accident? Baby, we planned that whole thing. Even down to the wine she drank a day before." The fool nearly gulped the whole glass. The friend laughed, asking if she wasn't scared of ghosts. Ngozi replied coldly, "If Amarachi's ghost comes for me, she better come with her lawyer too. Because I'm enjoying her money very well." Amarachi played that recording over and over. Each time it burned less and fueled her more. These weren't careless slip-ups, they were full confessions. With Barrister Kenneth's help, she transcribed every word, dated every clip, and cross-referenced them with forged documents Chaik had submitted. Everything was aligning. What her enemies didn't understand was that Amarachi wasn't planning to strike like a thief in the night. She was building a public noose, one they would hang themselves with in front of the world. Despite her silence, Amarachi made strategic moves through her lawyer, disguised as anonymous legal challenges and leaked media reports. Board members began receiving calls from regulatory bodies. Anonymous tips were sent to banks holding joint assets. Old vendors Amarachi had once worked with began questioning new financial orders placed by Ngozi under forged authority. The mansion staff, sensing something was shifting, grew tense. Some even began whispering, saying, "Madam Spirit, no day rest." The irony was lost on them. Madam Spirit was very much alive. Amarachi observed all of this from her dim hideout, recording, documenting, and waiting. Because it was no longer just about betrayal. It was about justice. And justice, Amarachi had learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it watches. And when it moves, it does so with the force of silence that drowns the screams of the guilty. Ngozi had always wanted more, but now, with Amarachi gone, she wanted everything. She no longer pretended to be modest. She strutted around the mansion like a queen, ordering the house staff to repaint rooms in her favorite colors and discard Amarachi's furniture. She brought in interior decorators from Lagos and ordered new imported curtains, chandeliers, and wall paintings, all billed to Amarachi's foundation account. She even went so far as to hire a celebrity stylist to revamp her wardrobe. In every photo she posted on social media, she made sure to include hints of her new lifestyle: the grand staircase, the golden wine cabinet, the luxury car. The captions were full of veiled mockery, from grace to greatness, or some ghosts bless the living more in death. But in her rush to ascend, Ngozi revealed what Amarachi had always known but ignored. Her hunger was never just for love or comfort. It was for power. It was for control. The staff began to whisper. Some were loyal to Amarachi in ways Ngozi didn't expect. The old cook, Mama Ebra, began muttering prayers in Igbo whenever Ngozi entered the kitchen. "This place is cursed now," she once said under her breath. The gardener, who had been with the family for 12 years, submitted his resignation quietly, saying he couldn't work under a woman who made the dogs sleep outside in the rain. But Ngozi didn't care. She laughed at their loyalty, dismissing them as relics of Amarachi's foolish era. To her, their disobedience wasn't resistance, it was jealousy. Her arrogance grew daily, and so did the cracks in her fabricated kingdom. Chike, once excited to parade her around, now found her loud, irritating, and overly demanding. He began returning home later than usual. When Ngozi questioned him, he barked at her. "You think you can ever match Amarachi's class?" That was the first time her smile truly cracked. The seeds of tension were now planted. Ngozi began to feel insecure. She increased her public appearances, demanding Chike attend functions with her. She pressured him to make their relationship official, to marry her publicly, and take full control of Amarachi's remaining assets. But Chike hesitated. Marriage meant too much publicity, and some lawyers had started asking uncomfortable questions. Deep down, Chike was afraid. Amarachi's death was too clean, too perfect. And Ngozi's boldness was beginning to draw unwanted attention. He suspected nothing supernatural, but something in his gut whispered that Amarachi's ghost hadn't truly left. "What if someone finds the truth?" he asked one night. Ngozi snapped, "Then bury it deeper." That night, Amarachi watched them argue from her surveillance feed and smiled faintly. The same woman who laughed at her naive loyalty was now growing paranoid in the house she stole. It was the beginning of her unraveling, and Amarachi would not stop it. She would record it. With her place in the mansion solidified, Ngozi's demands escalated from interior design to outright ownership. She wanted everything: properties, businesses, even Amarachi's private art collection. "I deserve all of it," she said one night to Chike, wearing Amarachi's favorite red nightgown. "You said she was holding you back. Now let me push you forward." But Chike, already overwhelmed with media scrutiny and rising financial tension from anonymous legal audits, pushed back. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "Half of these things are still legally tied to her name. And we haven't even done a public will reading. The world still sees her death as a tragedy. If we move too fast, people will ask questions." Ngozi slammed her glass against the floor, shattering it. "What are you afraid of?" "Her ghost." The irony in her voice was laced with fear. She had started hearing things: strange knocks in the hallway, Amarachi's old phone ringtone playing randomly from empty rooms. She was cracking. Her greed soon led her to make mistakes. She forged Amarachi's signature on a multi-million naira land transfer, but the receiving party flagged inconsistencies. Chike was furious. "Do you want to land us both in jail?" he barked, slamming his palm on the table. "Stop acting like this is a joke." Ngozi didn't flinch. She stared him down, venom in her eyes. "You think I came this far to play safe? I've sacrificed too much for this life. I won't go back to being poor. Never." The silence between them stretched painfully. Chike looked at her now with something new in his eyes, not desire, but regret. She was becoming unmanageable. Worse, her greed was pulling them into legal fire. And yet, he knew she was too deep in to cut off. If she went down, she'd take him with her. Amarachi watched this implosion with a cold, quiet resolve. The rope around their necks was tightening, and they were the ones pulling it. Amarachi's plan had worked perfectly. She had known from the start that their union wouldn't last. Their alliance was built on sin, and sin rarely knows how to share power. Now, watching them collapse under the weight of their ambition, Amarachi prepared the final phase of her return. She instructed Barrister Kenneth to activate the next trigger, a quiet petition to the Corporate Affairs Commission demanding a formal audit and public hearing on the misuse of her foundation's funds. Her lawyer submitted it under a false name, but backed it with real evidence. Soon, Chike and Ngozi would be forced to answer questions publicly. Amarachi wasn't just watching now. She was orchestrating. And as she looked at their crumbling relationship, she whispered to herself again, "Let the world hear them before they see me. I want them fully exposed, then I'll rise." The rot in their relationship started small, just whispers of irritation, moments of silence, sidelong glances during business meetings. But like all slow poisons, it grew. Chike and Ngozi, once bound by their lust and ambition, were now trapped in a castle built on lies. The intimacy they once shared in stolen hotel rooms had faded into cold arguments over funds, forged documents, and public appearances. Ngozi had become obsessed with owning everything, every last asset Amarachi left behind, and her obsession was suffocating Chike. She questioned every bank alert, monitored his calls, accused him of hiding funds. "Don't forget I know everything," she hissed one night when he snapped at her. "I was there when we planned it, remember?" But Chike no longer feared her threats. He had begun to realize something he never saw in the beginning. Ngozi wasn't Amarachi. She didn't carry herself with grace. She didn't command loyalty with silence. She was loud, reckless, and quickly becoming a liability. Their quarrels became more frequent, more vicious. One evening, in front of staff, Chike yelled, "You'll never be her. You wear her things, sleep in her bed, but you'll never match her dignity." The silence that followed his outburst was heavy. Ngozi stood frozen, her lips trembling, her eyes wet, not from pain, but from rage. That night, she smashed Amarachi's this unraveling chaos, off the wall, stood Chuka, and locked herself no longer the forgotten boy from the slums. The staff, but now a billionaire in his own right. Some whispering among themselves orchestrated that every legal battle, cursed. Every contract one of the maids claimed she had heard Amarachi's voice, his logistics softly at night, had grown so another powerful swore she saw even multinational in the gardens at midnight now relied on whether these for their were hallucinations or fabrications. He had strategically partnered with companies that began to live in that house, offering them better deals. Once a more reliable services, was now a haunted and palace cutting their costs filled with paranoia. His name echoed in boardrooms, and shadows neither of them could clean her son. But as Mr. Amarachi, CEO of CN Global Holdings, had become, he sat behind his mahogany desk in his glass tower office, watching it all from her hidden reports flowed in of no satisfaction. Stocks, not and collapsing empire. She didn't want just his cracks. Smile was cold. She wanted collapse. His eyes but sharper the cracks than ever. Were promising. "I told you." They told he whispered to that himself, her silence had staring power. At Obina's company logo on the report. They had won. You gave her leverage, but not yet. No confrontation. Not yet. Could have the grand given. Ballroom at the Lagos International Business. She saw Chike Summit spend more nights in his office, crystal avoiding Ngozi. It was an event reserved for the elite call lawyers, billionaires, to ask about governors, the legal CEOs, and international marriage rights posthumously. Obina had attended the event for decades. Now, she often seated at the high lawyer table, had paused awkwardly, envied, technically and respected. But the timing may raise red flags. His name was still on the invitation. Amarachi, but his position on the desperation had dropped. The woman who once people no longer were being too humble. Some was now groveling to be made legitimate. Behind she wanted a title, a crown, the final blow, but Amarachi when the had made sure the throne for the evening was lined with thorns. A name soon, most of them those had recently come to respect. The financial unraveling began like a whisper. Please small debts appearing where there should have been surplus. Global Holdings. Partners pulling out Mr. joint ventures without clear explanation. Erupted in applause. Chike initially blamed market forces. His fork dropped. The economy is unstable. His heart skipped. He said during a board meeting. The double doors swung open. His voice tight, and there he was. But Chuka, the truth was but uglier. Not the Chuka Amarachi's anonymous audits. Gone was the skinny, frozen-eyed boy of the past. Pending investigations. In his place stood a man dressed in a perfectly tailored black who once supported her foundation, sparkling were retracting with pledges that alone international partners requested meetings to understand leadership transitions. His skin glowed. One American investor trimmed to even asked bluntly his posture during a Zoom call, like royalty. Is the late Mrs. Amarachi scanned the room with the calm of a lion among signed with her name until they locked with Obina's and Amarachi. Amara's muttered something about legacy continuity. Seemed to pause. The investor didn't respond. Choked on her wine. Instead, her hand trembled later as to announce their withdrawal against her teeth from a multi-million-dollar clean water project. And so the dominoes began to fall. Came out. Chaik wasn't just losing money. He was losing credibility. His cologne, behind a trail of dominance, and took the stage. With Barrister Kennett's help, she quietly reactivated and filled with subtle jabs that only a few entities legally separate from her husband's empire. His voice rich and commanding began recalling empires, exposing fraudulent ledger entries, and demanding court with their bare hands understand within a month the value of loyalty. Had 6 pending legal notices and on his desk. He began snapping at staff, firing managers. The applause was everyone of sabotage. Camera flashes, the media picked up on the chaos. But at one corner of the hall, shifted from Billionaire's tragic loss. Her eyes unable to tear away from the man she once mocked as a poverty-stricken boy. Amarachi's will forge. Her lips trembled as reality hit her like a storm. Why was Ngozi now appearing in company meetings? Much bigger. Amarachi swallowing the humiliation leaking like small pieces of information anonymously to investigators in his head, whispered, a popular you should have never thrown that boy away, title, but it was too late. The empire Amarachi built, now they had turned. The comment section exploded. Suddenly, she sat in her walk-in closet, staring at shelves. People began to wonder if Amarachi had died and jewelry that now felt meaningless. The public love story her mind was being back to the boy by suspicion. Who once walked barefooted to bring her food. Sat back, the boy watching the destruction just to pay her hostel like a symphony. The boy she had composed, humiliated, she felt no joy. But the man she saw today was no boy. Chaik was now drowning in the same sea. And worse, he once tossed her who now held her destiny in his hands. She tried to salvage things with fake tears on social media. Posting throwback pictures with stubborn pride, writing captions to let her admit she loved us. Maybe it's not too late. We're honoring her in our own way. Maybe if I apologize, maybe still you're a witch. As she thought, one said, the bitter truth. You're celebrating her death. She didn't deserve another. Amarachi, on the other hand, each one sat with emotionless eyes, surrounded by lawyers, what she had financial advisors, could never be regained, and a pile of lawsuits. But justice that grew higher by the hour. Possible. His once loyal staff were resigning, like a distant train heading straight for the house of lies they built. Clients were canceling contracts, had made sure that when he could read the termination notice for anyone. The realization hit rumors like a freight train. Whispers. Chuko was conversations among distant relatives. The boy he once denied during gala events and disowned had become the architect of his collapse. But now, rage boiled. The whispers were full-blown accusations against his glass table, shattering too soon. Sending people began to say, flying across the room. Chaik remarried too soon. I will destroy him. Ngozi moved in less than 2 weeks sitting before him Amarachi's death. Instead, he sighed deeply. Online communities started investigating nothing you can do. Pulling his company pictures. It's too comparing big. He owns the entire supply chain Twitter now. Thread titled, you can't fight him. Billionaire you can't stop murdered him. His wife. Meanwhile, in his penthouse, racked up hundreds of thousands of shares by the glass window. People were beginning to connect the city lights. His Amarachi's accident, a message from one of his managers. Obina Holdings was never found. Another contract. There had been no open autopsy. Dropped 17%. No formal reading of a will. He smiled, just but not out of joy, ceremony, out of vindication, and a celebration. This is what they more like a coronation. And yet, in the center of it all, satisfaction was a heavy truth. The so-called best friend, amount of wealth, the social media pages once filled with sympathy and Obina left on his soul, were now littered. But if life had taught him anything, emojis, it was that scars were not weaknesses. Desperate to salvage her image of survival. Granted an exclusive interview, adjusted his cufflinks, and whispered in trying to control the narrative. The game isn't over yet. She wore all it's only just beginning. Her eyes glassy. The boy they left for dead had become a storm. I miss Amarachi every day. They would drown in the very voice they threw him into. She was my sister. Walls of Chief Obina's mansion, the interviewer leaned forward dramatically, darker than death. So what do you say to the rumors that you and her husband were already dating? The clinking of wine glasses, Ngozi and the constant feigned gasp of political visits. That's a wicked lie. Instead, people don't understand grief. Court letters, Chaik, and I found comfort in each other's pains. Every sheet and nail in the coffin of his crumbling empire, watching from her hideout, as Obina scrambled to salvage what was cold precision. The universe didn't know how to final blow because she never loved. Shake the very ground he stood on. Fake loss. It came and the world could smell it, like lightning striking an already burning tree. The one thing during one of his desperate attempts to secure a loan, when fate, the bank eventually collapses asset verification, meanwhile, and lineage confirmation had quietly reopened Amarachi's case. But what followed? An anonymous letter had reached the deputy commissioner's desk to verify his financial inconsistencies, a formality, and he never thought twice about. Ngozi wearing the dagger he never saw coming. Less than 48 hours. The medical report after her declared death. But to Obina, the letter was signed like a death sentence. Let the dead speak. His eyes scanned the paper over and over. Had made sure every breadcrumb was followed with care. Trickling down his temple. She didn't want them arrested yet. Not until they were fully exposed due to a severe untreated infection. But she wanted them watched, sustained, interrogated, years ago, cornered, leading to irreversible
was now
azoospermia. And as Amarachi sat in front of her wall, was sharp with evidence. He couldn't father a child. Steady. He had never been able to. Not they tried to erase me quietly. But that wasn't all. I'll return loudly. Right beneath it in but bold, not as a wife, as their judge. Chukwunwosu shares no biological relation to Obenokoro. Not the type of knock that precedes a friendly visit, but the firm, deliberate knock for air, of men as trained to take people away. Had been sucked out of the room. Was seated at the dining table, vision darkened, trying to ignore as reality endless complaining about her postponed was never my biological when his son came in nervously, but what terrified him more, sir, was police infertility revelation and EFCC. It was a legal trap. He unknowingly stood up for himself, confusion knitted across in his younger days, desperate to save, he muttered, from family ridicule over his inability to father children. Moments later, had signed an affidavit officers stepped into the compound with solemn authority from her previous relationship mid-sentence as his son. The lead officer presented a court-backed, never meant to have long-term consequences, sealed, but and stamped for both document and binding in court. The charges were weighty. Fraud was his only child and suspected foul play. No amount of DNA denial to the sudden death of Amarachi Okafor. The companies, the properties in the room changed. Were tied to Ngozi's mouth as the next of kin. Her confidence felt his chest tighten, passing second. His heartbeat erratic. You can't arrest me. He staggered. I'm not clutching the edge of his mahogany desk. Until his knees gave tried to take control. The mighty chief, but even his once intimidating voice cracked under pressure. Lord of wealth. This collapsed is a mistake. To the marble floor. We've cooperated with authorities, clutching his chest as his allegations are slander him. The officer didn't blink. Right there. Then come to the station his and world clear your name. Didn't just crumble. Chike's lawyer called in haste. Arrived moments later and begged for a private rushed to the hospital. But by then, paralyzed on his right side. Cameras twisted, had arrived, speech slurred. Neighbors had the doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. The media, but the damage by Amarachi's anonymous body was had received a tip-off. His empire was slipping from his grip faster than sand through fingers. Billionaire Chike Okafor arrested on a fraud and murder allegations. The legal world, the headlines lightning speed. Ngozi, crying now, was handcuffed and bundled into the black SUV that Obenokoro. Chike stood in front into action, which once stood as a symbol of wealth, freezing now surrounded by shame. Seizure of property. He caught a glimpse of his reflection in the car window. Every asset registered under Obenokoro. He didn't look powerful. Holdings now legally belonged to Chukwunwosu. And the worst part was, there was no escaping know the full truth behind the fall. No salvation. At the police station, the questioning began. The same officers laid out photos, documents, and hide his infertility. Each became the chain stripped away him layers of their lies. The news spread like wildfire. Hoping for reassurance. Global Holdings acquires Obenokoro was stone cold. In historic takeover. He knew the storm had finally all arrived. Over the news, and they were standing in quicksand. The financial markets. During the interrogation, headlines screamed the officer asked a chilling question. Untouchable empire. Why did you celebrate her funeral? Social media so boiled with gossip when the body was never found. Reporters gathered outside the hospital. Opened her mouth, eager, but no words came of the fallen titan. The officer leaned forward. Staff from Obenokoro Holdings, she's dead? Who once mocked Chuka, now Chike swallowed hard. Job applications. Of course, he was CN Global, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Hadn't just turned. Ngozi began sobbing, they had flipped, hands shaking, and crushed. Her fake everything world was crumbling. Inside the hospital, all she could think about was the last glass of champagne the white ceiling in Amarachi's gown, leaking from the side of his mouth. The station, his mind screamed louder than his paralyzed lips. Amarachi's voice played on recording again. His eyes darted around when the door opened, laughing, and there stood Chuka. The noose had been placed, regal. All that remained was dressed for the executioner navy blue suit. The day Amarachi decided to return in person, polished, Abuja was buzzing with gossip. Behind him stood a lawyer. Social media was flooded with clips of Chike. Then Ngozi being dragged out of their answers. Faces walked in slowly, shame, no anger, no rage, but amidst just an eerie, one car drove quietly. He stood by the hospital bed, looking down at a woman dressed in dragged him through the mud of humiliation, covering her face. Chuka said, her hands, his voice like velvet, her posture real. Her signature dangerous. You made thinking you were the courthouse was filled with became the same family signature that Foundation Board representatives. Obenokoro's mouth twitched. The hearing had been called to address all charges of fraud and allegations surrounding Amarachi's mysterious I'm not here for revenge. What no one expected was her appearance. I'm only here to remind you that the son you threw away is now the man who owns everything. Her lawyer guiding her forward like a soldier returning from exile on the bedside table. Whispers followed. Rest well. Who is that? Father. That can't be who I think it is. Amara sat in disbelief as a team of court officials, courtroom, accompanied by police officers, beside his lawyer, marched in, his face pale and gaunt from lack of sleep. You are hereby instructed her once flawless makeup smudged. All assets her design are now under the legal ownership of CN. She looked like a ghost of the woman the who had once paraded through her hands trembled as reality the judge hit harder than a slap. Just as the prosecutor once paraded in one of the recordings, where she laughed at Chuka, the double doors was now being empty, and a hushed room by room across the courtroom. The servants, every eye turned, bossed around, Amarachi stepped behind her slowly, still some mocked her silently, her presence heavy, some filmed like her thunderclouds. Amara rushed to her closet, each step, grabbing bags, the prosecutor paused, and jewelry, stunned, stuffing them into suitcases. Blinked twice, but the officer and then stopped her. The woman removed her veil. Most of these items are company properties across the room. Purchased with joint assets. A woman screamed. Only Ngosi's mouth is allowed. Her hands she gasped uncontrollably. No, you can't do this. Stood abruptly. You can't. Knocking over his chair. But they could. His mouth wide in horror. Everything she once called her stood the tall, chandeliers, unbroken, the Persian and very much alive. The fleet of cars. I believe the marble this trial concerns my death. All tagged and marked for seizure. Her voice calm. Investors drove full by, controlled slowing their cars. The court just descended into chaos. Public humiliation. Cameramen rushed forward. Those fake society women who used to crowd her parlor his gavel and gossip. Now shouting for cryptic statuses Amarachi pretending flinch. They had always known she wasn't worthy. Box. Amara collapsed onto the floor, the prosecutor, wailing, now holding her head composure, as her world turned slowly around her, eyes wide her phone with disbelief. Rang endlessly. Mrs. Amarachi Okafor, old friends, whispered, now you're demanding the money. Amarachi looked directly at Shaikh, her hands trembled. Yes, her stomach churned. And I've been listening since meeting Obina. She placed a USB stick on the table. Powerless. I have the rest of the recordings. As if fate hadn't stabbed her deep enough, of every document they forged, with every lie they told, pulled up. Shaikh the back door opened, and out breathing heavily. His eyes scanned the chaos. Their resurrection settled on her. But it wasn't salvation, not with hate. It was judgment, but with an emptiness colder than death. Though finally called to Amara scrambled to her knees, like a volcano, tears barely smudging holding its lava. Her hands everyone stared as she crawled toward him, like an apparition. Please, some weapon disbelief. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. Like the media, I scrambled to capture every angle. I was stupid. But Amarachi stayed firm, but Chuka raised his hand, control, silencing her. Veil now voice was over her shoulders, too calm, like a banner of survival. I forgave you a long time ago, she began, looking directly at Shaikh. For me, but they forgot your chapter in my life is closed. Her voice echoed permanently across the courtroom. Her tears I didn't just survive. Please, I documented everything, she whimpered. I watched them destroy, adjusted his cufflinks with blood and loyalty. Behind I heard them laugh, the mansion gates closed, and spend my wealth time before my body turned cold. They closed on her. Them. The morning after the mansion was today, felt they faced the real ghost of their greed. Amara woke up on the cold tile floor of a tiny guest room that a distant relative grudgingly, not just to listen, to sleep in, but to witness. A far cry from the king-size over flash drives and silk, bank statements, messages, her phone, more recordings, which once buzzed with invitations was to exclusive parties and high-end shopping sprees. As the evidence was displayed on the court's collectors and journalists, the room looking to exploit her fall audio clips of Ngosi's social media was on fire. Shaikh's voice, pictures of her being dragged out of the mansion, signed her designer bags snatched in her hands. Ngozi began like shaking visibly. She whispered, flooded the internet. Please tell them I didn't mean scream. But her voice was drowned by the speaker to homeless. A clip where she Amara's said, tragic if Amarachi's ghost comes, friends she once died with blocked her number. The irony to call her murmurs of disgust now pretended they never knew her. Even the judge betrayed frowned deeply, rejected by the very society. The weight of his betrayal finally in a desperate attempt to salvage his once proud dignity. The only sounds were every ounce of courage and the raw and undeniable corporate head crashing through the towering skyscraper overlooking the city. Turned once more the very symbol of everything I built he had become. I trusted you, guards recognized her sacrifices, whispering among themselves. But what some didn't know, what you never understood, is that silence isn't weakness. With no makeup to mask her swollen, tear-streaked face, is the deadliest weapon a betrayed woman can wield. Her final words hung in the air like a dagger. Amara stammered. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Checks were done. And eventually couldn't meet her gaze. The message Ngozi covered her face, executive floor, shaking uncontrollably. When the doors to his office opened, began exiting to file their breaking like a funeral drum. Wife declared there he was, dead, returned behind a mahogany desk, exposes husband dressed in a black suit. Gold the judge pen in finally hand, cleared his throat, signing documents worth more than anything we will reconvene in her life to review this evidence in full. To her knees the moment their eyes met. Let the record show. Please Mrs. forgive me, Amarachi Okafor. I was very much alive. I didn't know
Outside
she
the
saw
courthouse,
crawling
hundreds
toward
had
him.
gathered.
And when
I missed the
Amarachi
man who
stepped
once
out,
brought me
her
food
head high,
when my mother
a
was
thunderous
sick.
applause
The man who
erupted,
paid my school
not
fees,
for celebrity
I
or
missed.
sympathy.
I missed
but
the
for the
man
return
I
of truth.
betrayed.
The courtroom
Chuka stood
reconvened
slowly,
2 days
walked
later,
around the table,
under maximum
towering
security
over her broken
The
frame.
entire country
His
was
eyes
watching.
were void of warmth.
News stations
"You missed the
had
man you
set
spat
up
on?"
outside.
he asked quietly.
Live streams were
Voice
ongoing,
calm, but
on
sharp
Twitter
like a blade.
and Instagram.
The man you
Hashtags
called
like
poverty-stricken,
hashtag
the man you
Amarachi
laughed at while
hashtag
guards dragged him
Jack the
out of the mansion you
and
now begged
hashtag
for.
Ngozi
Her
the
sobs
betrayer
grew
were
louder.
trending across
She
Africa.
grabbed his shoes.
Inside
Her
the courtroom,
tears soaking the
Amarachi
leather.
sat beside
But
her
then
legal team,
Chuka knelt,
composed
not to
of
comfort
human
her,
rights lawyers,
but to look her
financial
dead in the
forensic
eyes.
analysts,
"I
and her
forgave
loyal
you," he
family
said
lawyer,
softly.
Barrister Kenneth.
But forgiveness
She wore
doesn't
all
mean
white
restoration.
restoration. Symbolic,
You lost me.
clean, untouchable.
Forever.
Across
With
the
that,
room
he
sat
stood,
Chike,
nodded
aged
at the
overnight.
security standing
His
by,
eyes were
and
hollow,
whispered,
his face
square,
pale,
lips cracked.
The last thing
Next to
Amara
him,
saw was the
Ngozi
office
was now
door
unrecognizable.
closing. Not just
Her
the
wig
physical
disheveled,
door,
eyes
but the door
swollen,
to the life
her fingers
she once
trembling
destroyed with her own
uncontrollably.
hands. They both
News
looked like
of Chief
ghosts
Obina's
of their
death
former
broke
arrogant selves.
a week later,
And that
a
was
massive
before
cardiac
the real
arrest
evidence began
It
to
wasn't
play.
sudden. His body
The
had
court
been failing
projector
since the
came
day
alive.
the DNA
Amarachi's
results
voice
arrived.
filled the
But
courtroom.
what truly killed
Calm,
him wasn't the
collected,
stroke,
and
it wasn't the
unshakable.
financial loss.
Recording one,
It was the
February
realization
15th,
that the son
2025,
the boy he
bedroom,
mocked,
master
was the
suite.
same man
The speakers
who buried him,
echoed
not with
Ngozi's
soil,
laughter,
but with
She's
success
too
so
stupid
loud
to
that
suspect.
even death couldn't
Let her
silence
drink.
it. His
Let her
funeral
rest
was a
in
quiet
peace,
one,
with her Bible.
no governors,
Guests
no
filled the
senators,
room.
no
Chike's
business
voice.
partners. Once those
Only a
shares are
handful of
transferred,
distant
we move
family
on.
members.
I'll
A
marry
disgraced
you,
Amara,
and the world
seated
will
at the
adjust.
far corner.
Hiding
Amarachi
her tear-stained
watched their
face
faces twist
behind
in
a
shame,
veil of shame.
but she did not
The mighty
flinch.
Chief Obina,
The judge
whose
kept a
name
straight
once
face,
commanded cities,
but his knuckles
was
were
lowered
white
into
from
the
how
ground.
tightly
Forgotten
he gripped his
by
gavel.
the very society
More recordings
that once
followed.
kissed his feet.
Forged asset transfers,
As the
whispered
final
threats,
sand
and a
covered the
damning
casket,
message from Ngozi.
Chuka stood
I'm
silently,
not afraid of ghosts.
hands folded.
Even if she came
dressed
back,
in
who
all
would believe
black.
her?
But there was no
Amarachi
care
turned
in his
slightly
eyes.
then,
No
locked
suddenness.
eyes with Ngozi,
Just a
and
deep,
said softly,
solemn silence.
"The world does
His
now."
mother stood beside
the courtroom
him,
fell
gripping
into
his
a
arm,
mixture of
whispering
shock,
prayers,
disgust,
not
and
for the
grief.
dead.
Some
but
in
for
the
the
gallery
living.
openly
"My
wept,
son," she said
especially
softly,
women
"let this
who
be
had
the last day
admired
you carried
Amarachi
this
for
burden.
years.
Let the earth
One
take it
elderly
with him."
woman said out loud.
Chuka nodded.
This is what they
but
did
his
to her.
eyes remained
Chike
on the
lowered
grave,
his head,
not
unable
because
to
he
speak.
mourned a father,
Ngozi
but because he
buried her
stood
face
as
in her
living
palms,
proof
mumbling,
that the grave
"I
could
didn't
not
mean it like
bury the
that."
truth. But there was
Nor
no
could
sympathy
betrayal
left
bury
for her.
destiny.
Amarachi
As the guests
stood
dispersed,
again.
they
Chuka
used my
remained for a
silence
moment longer,
as a license
whispering
to
under his
my
breath.
death. You
But I
tried
turned
to
their
erase me,
arrogance
but
into
today
evidence.
it is you the
They
world
thought I
has
was
erased.
dead, but I
And
was
with that, he
documenting
turned
every
every
breath they took.
on the grave.
They
on the
taught me one
past,
thing,
and on every
power is
scar
not in
that led him
shouting.
there.
It's in
Months
rising
later,
quietly,
the skyline of the
and
city
returning
bore the
when they
towering
least
sign.
expect it.
CN
The judge
Global
called
Empire,
for a brief recess
legacy in motion.
before official charges
Chuka's
were
story
laid.
became legend.
As Amarachi,
The boy who
exited
was
the
mocked for
courtroom,
being poor,
the press
betrayed
surrounded
by
her,
love,
but she said
rejected
just
by
one
blood.
sentence,
Only
"There's
to
no
rise
vengeance
and
sweeter
own
than the
everything
truth
they ever denied
unveiled
him.
in front of the
He
wicked."
didn't just build wealth.
2 weeks later, he built
The
hospitals,
federal high court
funded
officially
scholarships
ruled
for
in
struggling
Amarachi's
youth,
favor.
opened free schools
The
for
evidence
girls
was
like Amara once
irrefutable.
was. The
But when
judge's
asked in
verdict
interviews
was scathing.
why he gave
Chike
back
was
so
convicted
much,
of conspiracy
his answer was
to
always
commit
the same.
attempted murder,
Because I know
financial
what it
fraud,
feels like to be
forgery,
thrown away,
and willful
As for Amara,
misrepresentation.
she
of
faded
corporate
into the
documents.
shadows.
Ngozi
No
was
one heard
convicted
of her
as an
again.
accessory
Some
to
say
attempted
she
murder,
left the city.
embezzlement,
Some
and
say
perjury.
she became a
Their
cleaner in a
sentences
restaurant
were
where the
symbolic.
waitresses whispered.
Chike lost
She was
everything.
once married,
His
to a
shares
billionaire,
seized, his company
but
stripped,
no one really
his
cared
assets
anymore.
frozen.
The only name
Ngozi
the
was
city
handed
remembered,
10 years, the
without
name that
parole.
echoed in
But
boardrooms,
beyond the
in
prison
schools,
bars and
in the
seized
hearts of
accounts,
those he lifted,
the true justice
was Chuka,
was social.
The boy they
Videos
mocked
of their
became
betrayal
the king
were
they never
everywhere.
saw coming.
NGO
Thank you for
funders
watching this
denounced
video.
Chike.
What did you
Ngozi's
learn from this
pictures
story?
were removed from
Drop it
brand
in the
campaigns.
comments.
Please
Make sure
society
you
that
like,
once
praised
praised
them,
and
now
subscribe
spit
to my
their
YouTube
names in
channel
anger.
TOCHI
Their
Stories for
fall
more.
was complete, not just in court, but in reputation.
reputation, legacy, and dignity. Amarachi hadn't just won. She had rewritten their story, exposing the rot beneath their designer suits and painted smiles. Outside court, Amarachi gave no interviews. She didn't need to. The world had heard her voice through the trial. Her truth had spoken for itself. Instead, she returned to her late father's village for 1 month, disappearing from the media cycle. There, she knelt beside his grave and wept, not from pain anymore, but from relief. "Papa, I survived," she whispered. "They thought they buried me. But you taught me that silence is not surrender." When she returned to Abuja weeks later, she wasn't the same woman. She was no longer the wife, no longer the grieving widow. She was a phoenix, burned but risen, quiet but unshaken. The board of her foundation reinstated her as chairwoman. And one by one, old allies returned, not to pity her, but to follow her. She had earned a new type of respect, one born not from power or wealth, but from survival with dignity. Amarachi never remarried. She didn't need to. She built a new mansion, smaller but peaceful, filled with art and books and rescued children. Her story inspired documentaries, poetry, and reform laws on spousal rights. And though many begged for interviews, she refused them all. Her silence was still her power. One day, a journalist slipped a question during a charity dinner. What would you say to Chaik and Ngozi today if you saw them again? Amarachi paused, smiled faintly, and replied, I'd thank them. The room fell quiet. Because sometimes God allows betrayal not to destroy you, but to introduce you to the version of yourself that doesn't need anyone's permission to rise. She turned, walked away, and never looked back again. Because she had buried the past, not with hate, but with a kind of peace that only the truly vindicated understand. Amarachi wasn't just the woman who came back from the dead. She was the woman who rose from it undefeated. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.